August the 20th, 1975, was a very special day for many scientists. It was the day of the Viking 1 mission to the red planet Mars. As the team of technicians settled down in front of their computers, instruments and monitor screens, the final check of the space vehicle was taking place. Everything was ready. The countdown had begun. This costly space adventure was about to swing into action to prove once and for all that given the right conditions, life could evolve from non-living matter. The basic law of biology states that life can only come from life. Yet, now and again, some scientists suggest that perhaps life could come from non-life. In medieval times, for instance, the scientific world was convinced that vermin and flies were generated directly from rubbish dumps or garbage. In fact, the belief was so strong that in 1668, the celebrated Italian scientist Francesco Redi had to demonstrate by means of a simple experiment that vermin and flies breed in garbage, they don't come from it. He placed a piece of meat in 3 separate flasks. The first flask was covered with a piece of thin cloth, the second with a piece of paper, and the third was left open to the air. Very soon, flies started to enter the open flask and settled on the decaying meat. Although the flies couldn't enter the flask covered with the cloth, they could smell the meat and settled on top. The one covered by paper blocked in the smell, and the flies ignored it. After some time, maggots appeared on the meat in the open flask. Maggots also appeared on the thin cloth covering the second flask. The decaying meat in the third flask, however, that was covered by paper, had no maggots on it. It was then obvious to all the scientists that the flies had laid their eggs on the meat in the open flask, and that these had hatched into maggots. As the flies could not get to the meat in the flask covered by the cloth, and could only smell it, they laid their eggs on the cloth. The flask covered with paper had no smell of meat, and so the flies were not attracted to it. This flask was free of maggots. 2 centuries later, however, belief by scientists in spontaneous generation was again very strong. This time it concerned the microscopic world of bacteria and algae. They just seemed to come from nowhere, and most people believed they were generated from the matter where they were found. One of the greatest scientists of all time, Louis Pasteur, didn't share this view. He was convinced that the basic law of biology, that only life begets life, was just as good for bacteria as it was for vermin and flies and all other living things. So, before a skeptical audience, he too performed an experiment. He first took a flask, put some broth in it, which he sterilized, and sealed it. No bacteria formed on the broth. Then he used a flask with a narrow S-bend top. As the dust or particles carrying bacteria were blocked in the neck of the flask, no bacteria reached the broth. The scientific world was obliged to accept the facts. A century later, the belief has grown again that life can come from non-living matter. This time, it is believed that long, long ago, primitive life had been developed from primitive gases and chemicals. So, all eyes were fixed on Mars. The reason was that its atmosphere and climate, although extremely cold and dry, is more like Earth's than any other planet. Mars seemed to be just what was required, a sort of natural laboratory floating in space that could settle the question of whether life could evolve from non-life. There would no longer be much doubt that life evolved on Earth if traces of life could be found elsewhere. The Viking space rocket was equipped with one of the technological miracles of our day, a miniature science lab capable of performing all the experiments of a modern university laboratory, but only a cubic foot in size. This fantastic apparatus was lowered onto the Martian surface and the experiments began. It was designed to scoop up soil, analyze it with its ultra-modern instruments, and send the results back to Earth. Of one thing, the scientists felt sure. If life was not existing at present, it would have existed in the past. There were indications that surface water had once been present on Mars, and this would have created conditions similar to those that were believed to have originally existed on Earth. The excited scientists could hardly wait to process the data that was pouring into mission control. Then came the shock. It was more like an immense disappointment, probably similar to that experienced by their ancestors at the time of Louis Pasteur's experiment. They had been so sure that life could be generated from non-living matter that it was almost unbelievable to find out that the Martian soil was sterile. Not only was there no sign of life, but there was no proof that life had ever existed in the past. They checked and rechecked the data. The story was the same. In case they had missed something, a second mission had been organized. The launch of Viking 2 on the 9th of September 1975 rekindled the hopes of some of the scientists. The new data was cold comfort. It just confirmed the truth that no life had ever existed on Mars. Of course, questions started to be asked. After all, an enormous amount of money had been spent, and the believers in evolution theory were farther away than ever from providing any sort of concrete proof for their belief. The investment had provided virtually nil returns, and taxpayers' money seemed to have been used on trying to justify a belief of a number of scientists in a theory unsupported by scientific data. Some were even saying that the results indicated that the whole notion of spontaneous generation evolution should be abandoned. This program takes over where Viking 1 and 2 left off. Scientists are interviewed who have researched various aspects of evolutionary theory to find out what the present position really is. Many people believe that the fossilized remains of animals proves that evolution has taken place in the past. And to find out whether this is really the case, let's turn to the science which studies fossils, the science of paleontology. Professor Roberto Fondi is a specialist in paleontology. He teaches at the Department of Earth Sciences in the University of Siena in Italy. Amongst his other activities, he acts as scientific advisor for the reconstruction of prehistoric animals.
You may be surprised to know that the fundamental assumptions upon which evolutionary thinking is based are not at all confirmed by paleontology.
What are those assumptions?
Firstly, that living cells arose from non-living matter by spontaneous generation. This means that purely as a result of a chain of chemical reactions in a hypothetical primordial soup, a living cell was formed. Secondly, that these cells grouped themselves together into colonies to form complex multicellular structures. These structures were then supposed to transform, during the course of time, into animals and finally man. According to these assumptions, the ancestors of all living creatures, including man, can be traced back to a single cell. This ancestry is represented as a gigantic genealogical tree with numerous branches sprouting from a single trunk whose roots sink directly into non-living matter.
And doesn't paleontology confirm those assumptions?
Non conferma affatto queste assunzioni. I vari gruppi biologici.
Not at all. All the biological groups, from bacteria and blue-green algae to man, appear abruptly in the fossil record without any links connecting them with each other.
Why is it then that so many people believe the fossils prove evolution?
Bene, la teoria dell'evoluzione viene insegnata.
Evolution is presented to grown-ups and taught to the very young as a fact that has been verified and demonstrated for so long that it is a waste of time and even ridiculous to question it.
Bene, io nei miei due libri, oltre Darwin
In my books, Beyond Darwin and the Organistic Revolution, I give the names of well-known scientists who firmly believe evolution is a proven fact, such as George Gaylord Simpson and Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University. Yet there are also equally well-known scientists who believe in evolution and admit there is no real proof, such as Émile Guyonneau of the University of Geneva and G.A. Kearcut of Southampton University.
Però ammettono pianamente che di essa non c'è nessuna prova.
So, what is the truth of the matter? Well, there is a history book of the past, and that is the rocks and the fossilized remains in them. So it is up to the paleontologist to read that book and give the answer.
And what do you read in that book, Professor?
In questo libro io leggo semplicemente che
The fact is that after nearly 2 centuries of intense research, the paleontological evidence for evolutionary theory is not only rare, but highly questionable. The point is that if evolution had really happened, the evidence would be in great abundance and incontestable. The museums would be overflowing with fossils, clearly documenting the transitions between the various biological groups. Yet there are none. Moreover, there is no indication that the situation will change in the future. Those very few fossils which are claimed to show some kind of evolutionary link, such as the amphibians Ichthyostica and Simoria, the reptile Proponognathus, the bird Archaeopteryx, and the Australopithecine ape called Homo habilis, are very far from conclusive.
sono ben lungi dall'essere convincenti.
And what about the supposed evolution of man?
L'idea dell'uomo come
The idea of gradual evolution of man from such creatures as Australopithecine apes is totally without foundation and should be firmly rejected. Man is not the most recent link in a long chain of evolution. He represents a type or taxon which has existed without any substantial change since his first appearance. The justification for this statement is abundantly clear from my books.
So what then, Professor, is your final conclusion?
La mia conclusione è che la biologia
Quite simply, that more progress would be made in biology and other disciplines if they kept away from the dead-end roads of evolution mythology and resumed the fruitful approach of Aristotelian, Linnaean, Cuverian and Gothian morphology.
morfologia di tipo aristotelico, linneano, cuvieriano e ghettiano.
Biochemistry is the study of the very essence and structure of life. It goes into the very heart of matter, into the nucleus of the living cell. No one these days is more qualified to talk about whether one form of living organism could have changed into another than the biochemist. Professor Sermonti, a biochemist, geneticist, and molecular biologist of international repute, is just one of those scientists. So let's see what his views are on the subject of evolution.
Professor, in the light of present-day molecular biology, how would you view evolution?
Well, in fact, the recent discoveries of molecular biology have deeply changed our view on many problems. One of these problems is evolution.
In what particular way?
The results of molecular biology and genetics shown that the main claim of evolution, namely the fact that mutations are fixed by natural selection, is not true. What natural selection does is just eliminating the novelties which the mutation can create. Natural selection has a stabilizing effect on life.
But surely fossils show that animals and plants were different in the past than they are today, so they must have changed.
This is not true, because it's a mistake to think that if organisms were different in the past as compared to the present organisms, the present organisms should have derived from those which have disappeared. They have simply become extinct. But they have not given rise to new organisms. And this is, I would say, a general agreement. Nobody maintains that mammals derive from dinosaurs. It's obviously not the case. So this is a general misunderstanding. The fact that in the past we observe different organisms does mean that we derive from these organisms.
Evolution theory claims that some organisms, more primitive even than bacteria, have evolved over many years into man. What is your reaction, Professor, to this claim?
Well, I feel this is ridiculous. It's impossible. There is no way for a small organism to become man. But still more important is that what looks as a simple organism is in fact a very complex biological reality. Even bacteria have such complex genetic and biochemical make-up that they cannot be derived from simple forms.
But does this mean that all living things have always been complex right from the beginning?
Yes. This is what molecular biology and genetics have shown, definitely. The complexity is at the beginning.